There's a woman you probably know. Maybe she's your neighbor, your colleague, your old friend from school. Maybe she's you. She lives alone, moves through her days with a quiet kind of certainty. And when people ask her why she isn't with someone, she just smiles. Not the smile of someone hiding pain, something else entirely. Something that makes people uncomfortable in ways they can't quite explain. And that discomfort, that's what this story is really about. Because somewhere along the way, the world decided that a woman living without a partner was a problem to be solved, a puzzle to be figured out, a symptom of something broken. And yet, here she is. Not broken, not waiting, not lost, just completely, quietly, devastatingly herself. Let me take you somewhere first. Imagine a Tuesday morning. No alarm. She wakes up when her body is ready, makes coffee the way she actually likes it, not the way anyone else does. Sits by the window for 20 minutes doing nothing except existing inside her own thoughts. No performance, no compromise, no explaining herself to anyone. And in that silence, something lives that most people haven't touched in years, maybe ever. The raw, unfiltered experience of being exactly who you are. Most people call that loneliness. She calls it home. But how did she get there? And why does the rest of the world find it so threatening? That's what we need to talk about. Because what this woman is living isn't a trend or a phase or a reaction to some bad relationship. It's something much older, much deeper, and much more important than anything the culture around her is willing to admit. Let's go back a little. Not to her childhood specifically, but to the childhood of almost every woman alive. From the very beginning, girls are handed a story, not always with words. Often with images, with fairy tales, with the way adults react when a little girl says she wants to be alone. There's always a slight flinch, a gentle correction. Don't you want to play with the others? As if solitude, even in a child, is something to be fixed. As if the instinct to be with yourself is somehow a warning sign rather than a gift. So she learns early. Connection means approval. Being chosen means you have value. Your worth is reflected back through other people's eyes. And if nobody is looking at you, you begin to wonder if you exist at all. She carries that belief right into adulthood, into relationships that ask too much of her, into situations where she slowly empties herself out trying to fill someone else up, into the exhausting performance of being lovable, being easy, being low maintenance, being whatever the room requires her to be at any given moment. And for a long time, she thinks that's what love is. That's what closeness costs. That's the price of not being alone. Until one day, the price becomes too high, and she stops paying it. That moment doesn't always look dramatic from the outside. It rarely does. It might be a Wednesday evening when she's sitting across the table from someone who isn't really seeing her, someone who's talking at her rather than with her. And she realizes, with a clarity so sharp it almost hurts, that she is more alone in this moment than she has ever been by herself, more invisible in this relationship than she would ever be in an empty room. That's the fracture. That's where the story really begins. Because when something inside a person cracks open like that, one of two things happens. Either you rush to patch it over, fill the silence with the next person, the next distraction, the next story that lets you pretend everything is fine. Or you sit with the crack. You actually look inside it. And you discover that what you thought was emptiness is actually something else entirely. This woman chose to look, and what she found wasn't damage, it was depth, layers of herself she had never explored, because she'd always been too busy performing, too occupied with managing other people's emotions, too exhausted from loving in ways that were never really sustainable to begin with. She found anger she'd swallowed for years and called it flexibility. She found grief she'd buried under busyness and called it strength. She found desires and opinions and boundaries that she had quietly dismantled piece by piece in exchange for someone else's comfort. And when she began to gather those pieces back, something remarkable happened. She stopped feeling incomplete. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Here's where people start to misunderstand her. The world looks at a woman who has stopped shrinking herself to fit into relationships that don't deserve her, and it reaches for the simplest explanation. She must have been hurt badly. She must have trust issues. She must be emotionally unavailable. She must be afraid. But what if none of that is true? What if she simply woke up? There's a concept in psychology that the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung spent his entire life trying to articulate. He called it individuation, and it's genuinely one of the most powerful and misunderstood ideas in all of human thought. Individuation is the process of becoming who you actually are, not who your parents needed you to be, not who your culture shaped you into, not who your partner found most convenient, but who lives underneath all of that, at the core of your being, before anyone ever told you how you were supposed to show up. Most people never reach it, not because it's rare, but because it's uncomfortable. Because to become who you truly are, you have to first face everything you've been avoiding about yourself, the parts that feel unacceptable, the parts you've been taught to hide, the parts you've been ashamed of since childhood. Jung called these hidden parts the shadow, and he believed, with a certainty that only deepens the more you study human nature, that whatever we refuse to face in ourselves doesn't disappear. It shows up in our relationships, in our patterns, in the same arguments we keep having with different people, in the same wounds that somehow find us again and again, no matter how many times we try to start fresh. This woman stopped running from her shadow. She turned around and looked at it. And that, more than anything else, is why she now moves through the world differently. She's not perfect. She would be the first to tell you that. She still has fears. She still has nights where the silence feels less like sanctuary and more like proof of something missing. But she no longer lets those moments make decisions for her. She no longer confuses loneliness with the truth about her worth. And there is a kind of power in that, which is genuinely difficult to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it themselves. Think about the last time you were in a relationship, any kind of relationship, and you noticed yourself changing, softening your opinions, laughing at things that weren't funny, agreeing with things that didn't sit right. Not because you wanted to, but because something in you decided that keeping the peace was more important than being honest. Most of us have been there. Most of us have done some version of that dance. And most of us accepted it as normal, as the cost of love, as evidence that we cared enough to compromise. But there's a line between compromise and disappearance. And so many people, women especially, have crossed that line so many times for so many years that they no longer remember where it was. This woman found the line, and she planted her feet behind it. Not aggressively, not with manifestos or declarations, just quietly, firmly, in the way that only people who have truly learned something are capable of. She simply stopped accepting the terms that asked her to become less so that someone else could feel like more. And the people around her couldn't quite process it. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. When one person in a dynamic suddenly refuses to keep playing a role they've always played, everyone else is forced to reckon with the role they've been playing too. And that is deeply, profoundly inconvenient. So what does her life actually look like? What is it that she's protecting so fiercely? It's not independence in the way people romanticize it in self-help books. It's not a curated aesthetic of morning routines and journaling and green smoothies, though she may have some version of those things. It's something simpler and harder to photograph. It's the experience of waking up every single day and making choices that are truly hers. What she gives her energy to, what she walks away from, who she lets close, and who she politely, lovingly keeps at a certain distance. It's the extraordinary experience of being the author of her own days. She's learned, through real and sometimes painful experience, that her attention is one of the most valuable things she possesses, and she stopped giving it away to anyone who asked. This is where a lot of people, Men and women both start to label her as cold, as difficult, as too much. And it's worth pausing here and asking a question. Why is it that a woman who guards her energy is called cold, but a man who does the same thing is called discerning? Why is a woman with standards called unrealistic, but a man with high expectations is called ambitious? Why does a woman choosing herself still require an explanation in a way that a man making the same choice almost never does? These are not small questions. They reveal something about the invisible architecture we've all been living inside. The structure that tells women, from the very beginning, that their value is relational, that who they are to someone else matters more than who they are to themselves. And when a woman refuses to accept that architecture, when she tears down the parts that were never built for her, the world calls it a problem. She calls it freedom. Let me tell you something that doesn't get talked about enough in these conversations, about the actual texture of her days. Not the empowering parts, not the triumphant moments, but the real ones. There are nights when it's hard, when the apartment is quiet in a way that presses against her chest rather than soothes it. When she scrolls through her phone and sees someone else's anniversary photos or a video of a couple laughing at some private joke, and something in her chest goes tender in a way she doesn't always know what to do with. She doesn't pretend that doesn't happen. She doesn't need to, because she's made a distinction that most people spend their whole lives refusing to make. The distinction between what she feels and what is actually true about her life. Loneliness is a feeling, not a diagnosis, not a verdict, not proof that the path she's on is wrong. She feels it when it comes, the way she feels all her emotions now, fully, without trying to outrun it or fix it or fill it with something that will only create a different kind of emptiness later. And then it passes, the way all feelings eventually pass, when you actually let them move through you instead of building a life around avoiding them. That capacity to feel something difficult without being destroyed by it is one of the most underrated forms of strength in existence. It's not dramatic, it doesn't make good content, but it changes everything about how a person lives. There's a particular kind of woman who used to love too loudly, who used to pour herself into other people with a generosity that had nothing to do with abundance and everything to do with fear. Fear that if she didn't give everything, she'd be left with nothing. Fear that love was something you had to earn with constant effort and perfect behavior. Maybe you know her. Maybe you are her, or were her once. She was the one who answered texts at 2 a.m. even when she was exhausted. The one who rearranged her schedule, her preferences, her self-image to accommodate someone else's needs. The one who mistook intensity for intimacy and anxiety for passion. Who stayed in situations long past the moment her gut first told her to leave, because leaving felt like failure, and failure felt like proof of her deepest fear, which was that she wasn't enough. She was giving from a place of deficit, trying to love her way into a feeling of worthiness. And it never worked, because it was never actually about the other person. It was about the story she carried about herself. And at some point, she got tired. Not the tiredness of a bad week or a difficult relationship. The deep, cellular kind of tired that only comes when you've been living against the grain of your own truth for too long. She got quiet. She got still. And in that stillness, she began to hear something she'd been drowning out for years. Her own voice, her own knowing, her own sense of what she actually needed versus what she'd been told she was supposed to want. That voice changed everything. Here is something nobody tells you about the woman who has done this kind of inner work. She hasn't become less interested in love. If anything, she's more interested in it, more capable of it, more open to its real form. But its real form is almost nothing like what most people mean when they use the word. What she's looking for now is not rescue, not the electric chaos of someone filling all her gaps, not the constant low-grade anxiety of wondering if someone really loves her. She's looking for something far less cinematic and far more real. She wants a love that has room for both people to be fully themselves. A love where honesty is easier than performance, where she doesn't have to translate herself constantly, or apologize for taking up space, or dim her light so someone else feels comfortable. She wants a love that grows alongside her, rather than one that requires her to stop growing. That's not idealism. That's not a fantasy. That's a clear-eyed understanding of what a healthy relationship actually requires. And it requires, first and foremost, two people who have done at least some version of the inner work she's committed to. Two people who know themselves well enough to stop projecting their unresolved wounds onto each other and call it love. That kind of person is rare. She knows that. She isn't naive about it. But rarity doesn't make her lower the threshold. It makes her more patient. She would rather wait for something real than accept a convincing imitation. Because she's held the imitation before. She knows exactly how it feels. And she knows that no matter how good it looks from the outside, it hollows you out from the inside in ways that take years to recover from. There's a moment that happens for many women like her. A moment that is almost impossible to describe to someone who hasn't lived it, but when you hear it, you know immediately whether it resonates. It's the first time she chooses herself over the approval of someone she cares about. Not in a callous way, not in a way that harms anyone, just in the simple, quiet act of saying, "This is what I need," and then honoring that need, even when the other person is disappointed. The first time you do it, the anxiety is enormous. Everything in you that was trained to manage other people's emotions goes into overdrive. You wait for the consequences. You brace for the withdrawal of love that was always the punishment for choosing yourself. And then it doesn't come. Or it comes and you survive it. And you realize, perhaps for the first time, that your needs are not actually dangerous. That the world doesn't collapse when you are honest. That people who truly belong in your life will not leave because you stopped being endlessly accommodating. That moment is quietly life-changing. And once you've lived it, you cannot unlive it. She carries it with her now, like a compass. Every decision she makes passes through it. Does this require me to abandon myself? And if the answer is yes, then no matter how compelling the other variables, the answer is no. People look at her life sometimes and assume she must be proud, guarded, protecting herself behind a wall built from past hurts. And it's true that she's been hurt, genuinely, deeply hurt in the way that all people who have loved fully and gotten it wrong are eventually hurt. But her solitude isn't a wall. It's more like a garden with a gate. The gate isn't locked. It's simply not open to everyone. And it's not open to just anything. It opens for honesty, for depth, for the kind of conversation that actually goes somewhere. For people who show up as they truly are, rather than as whoever they think you want them to be. She's selective, the way a person who has been hungry for too long learns to be selective about food. Not because abundance isn't welcome, but because she's learned the difference between nourishment and filling space. The people who are in her life genuinely are in it, not decoratively, not out of habit or obligation. They are there because something real exists between them, something that feeds rather than depletes. And from the outside, that can look sparse. But from the inside, it feels like more than most people ever get, even surrounded by company. Jung also wrote about what he called the self, with a capital S. Not the ego, not the personality we present to the world, but the deeper organizing center of the psyche, the part of us that holds everything together, that knows at some fundamental level what we're supposed to be moving toward. Most people are in conflict with that part of themselves for their entire lives. Not because they're broken, but because the world around them, the culture, the family, the relationship structures they inherit, spends so much energy pointing them away from it. This woman stopped letting those external voices be louder than the internal one. And that, in the end, is the whole story. All of it. She isn't superior. She isn't enlightened in some distant, untouchable way. She's just someone who got honest with herself at a point in her life when most people are still choosing comfortable lies. And that honesty, though it cost her things she genuinely cared about, gave her back something she hadn't known she'd lost: herself. If you're watching this and something in you is stirring, I want you to sit with that for a moment, rather than immediately trying to figure out what it means or what you're supposed to do with it. Because sometimes that stirring is the most important information you have. It's the part of you that recognizes something real, even before your mind has caught up with it. It's your own version of that voice she found in the stillness, the one that's been there all along, trying to tell you something. Maybe you've been in a relationship that requires you to be smaller than you actually are. Maybe you've been alone and convincing yourself that something must be wrong with you for not being able to make it work with someone, anyone. Maybe you've been so focused on being loved that you've forgotten to ask whether the version of you that people love is actually you at all. These are not comfortable questions, but they're the right ones, and they're worth sitting with, even if they lead somewhere unexpected. Especially if they lead somewhere unexpected. Here's what I want you to take away from all of this, because I think it matters more than anything else that's been said. The woman who lives alone, who moves through the world with that quiet certainty, who smiles the smile that unsettles people, she's not your cautionary tale. She's not the sad ending of a story about a woman who couldn't make love work. She is someone who decided that love, real love, the kind that doesn't require self-betrayal, was worth waiting for, worth building the foundations for, worth becoming the kind of person who could actually receive it without flinching or shrinking or immediately trying to make herself smaller to fit inside it. She is someone who took the long road through her own interior landscape and came out the other side, not unchanged, but finally, truly, recognizably herself. And the love that eventually finds her, if it comes, when it comes, won't be a rescue. It will be a recognition. Two people who know who they are, standing in front of each other, and choosing, freely, without desperation or performance or fear, to walk in the same direction for a while. That is worth waiting for. That is worth becoming yourself for. And if you feel somewhere in your chest like you've been waiting too long, or like the path you're on is lonely in ways that are hard to admit, I want to offer you this. The waiting, when it's the right kind, is not empty time. It is the time you spend becoming someone who is finally ready to be fully known. And that is not nothing. That is everything. If this landed somewhere real for you, if something in here touched a part of your story that you haven't had words for until now, I want to hear about it. Leave a comment below. Not because engagement matters to an algorithm, though it does, but because you sharing your experience has a way of reaching someone else who needed to read exactly what you wrote at exactly the right moment. That's how these things work. We find ourselves in each other's honesty. Share this with someone you think might need it. Subscribe if you want to keep having conversations like this one. And come back because there is so much more to explore together. The most important love story you will ever live is the one you're in right now, the one with yourself. Don't let anyone rush you through it.